I've been watching a lot of videos on YouTube about 720s. Well, naturally, because I just got one, right? I've noticed this trend that everybody is constantly saying the 5 things, 3 things, whatever things I dislike about the 720. I get it. What I decided to do is I made a list of all the things they said they hate. I'm gonna go over them and see if they're as bad as they say or if it was just nitpicking. One complaint was the backup camera was in a horrible spot because the steering wheel blocks it when you turn. That is something that I noticed, and at first it was a problem for me. But what I figured out is that's actually for just judging the distance to the thing you're backing up towards. Bird's eye view in the center is really what you're supposed to be using to line yourself up and stuff when you're turning the wheel. So as long as you use both of those screens the way they were intended to, it's really not a problem. And it's someone that's just used to one view in their other cars. It's probably different for them just because the backup camera in the gauge cluster is just really for the distance. Another person said the doors are hard to open and the car is hard to get into. I don't find that to be the case at all. I'm 6'5" and I can get in and out pretty easy. I mean, it's low, so it's a little tough, but other than that, there's no real problems. To go with that though, a huge complaint for people is the seat. You either get no power seats and it's like the old school handle, you lift up, slide, lean back, like not a lot of adjustments. People complain about that because, well, for the price you're paying for this car, they say you should have power. For someone like me that's so tall, that's actually kind of a good thing, those types of seats, because they let the seat sit lower. There's not as much electronics under there that make you sit higher, so it would give me another inch of headroom. I have decent headroom. I have the power seats, and they are some of the most confusing buttons and hard to find out of any car I've ever owned. They kind of have to be though, because the 720 is so narrow in the cockpit that there's not a ton of room. So, I don't know if you could see them. So obviously the location makes it really hard to get your hand down there and adjust. That's problem 1. Problem 2 is the adjustments are unlike any other power seat. At first they're really confusing. But I mean, it just takes a few minutes, push the button, figure out what part of the seat it moves, and then adjust from there. So it really isn't as big of a deal because you can just store your seat settings in there and you never really have to touch them again. It's just a minor hassle until you store the seat and then you never have to worry about it. So overall, I say that's really not a big deal at all. That's people who haven't driven it enough to take time to just save their spot and be done. A huge complaint on almost everybody's list is the lack of a glove box. At first, I'm not gonna lie, kind of annoying to me too. But once you figure out all the other storage spots they put, it becomes, again, a non-issue. Each door has those compartments. Got the little net. You have all that storage up there. You have the center. You have this little area. So again, I think that's just because it's different than most cars. People aren't used to it, therefore they don't like it and they complain about it. A lot like Tesla, people say the build quality on them isn't great. One place they all pointed out was the steering wheel, if you have the carbon, just lifts, which I did notice on my 600 LT, but not this one. So however they're putting the carbon on the steering wheel seems to cause issues. The other issue they have is the gaps in the body. Like Tesla is an actual issue. I could just show you on my hood real quick. So this gap and this gap, they're not like off a ton, but just a little bit. And I think the biggest problem people have is when you spend this much money on a car, you really expect those types of things to be a non-issue. With the lightweightness and how much this car will flex a little bit, it's not a shock to me that that's something that's going to be a little bit off. I don't really have problems with that part. There is validity to that statement because even mine has them off a little bit. So I'm not gonna say they're wrong, it's just, it's not as big a deal as I think they make it. Sounds weird, but the brake pedal on this, a lot of the videos are also pointing out as an issue. It works, that's not the problem, it's just you really gotta push hard on that pedal, and it's totally different than all the other cars I drive. My BMWs, you just tap the brake and it's stopping. This, if you just tap the brakes, you feel like you're accelerating almost. It is an issue. The amount of pressure you have to push to get the car to stop. Cup holder. So we have this one. It's not super deep, but it will hold most of what you put in it. But the second one, for reference, business cards, not a lot of room. So it's really inconvenient. I don't even use it as a cup holder. We basically assume this has one cup holder in it. So they are 100% right on that. The cup holders are trash on this car. Everyone seems to think the buttons are confusing, which is true if the salesman didn't go over kind of how to drive the car. When you start the car, these are your transmission buttons, no big deal. Got the hazards, got launch, but then you got these knobs. So when you start it, first thing you want to do is hit that button. Then if you want to change your driving modes, you have to hit GPS that button. And then these are active, because if you don't push this button, this happens. Doesn't matter where these are. You have to push that. And then there's this button that puts the arrow up. You get the active arrow. Buttons are confusing, but once you learn them, they get real easy. You get a little startup sequence. It's no big deal. If you have your seatbelt on and you push those buttons, you actually don't have to take the parking brake off. It will take it off for you. But if you don't have your seatbelt on or you don't push those buttons, you have to turn the parking brake off. The parking brake is actually another one of the annoying things for me. There's no park in the car. The actually way to put it in park is put it in neutral and then set the parking brake. But if you just turn the car off, it does all that for you again. Another person complained about the noise those make. I don't mind it. And the side benefit to the shifters in a McLaren is you can upshift and downshift on each side. So depending on what side you're on, you can downshift, upshift. So you can drive basically one-handed, so if you are holding a drink or something, you don't have to like reach across, and it actually makes it way safer. The gas gauge is another thing that people really don't like, because it never is like consistent. Like my Raptor, there's not fluctuations, it just slowly goes down. It doesn't ever go back up. This one though, it's constantly changing, which I understand. I like it. So like that, when you're not driving, it's not going to show you. But when you are driving, it might say 120 or it might say 20. And the reason there's such a huge fluctuation is it's telling you based off your recent driving style how much gas you have left. So if you're driving super aggressive, it's like, hey, you only got about 20 miles left. But if you're driving conservative on the freeway, it will readjust back up, which to me is genius. And it's a little confusing at first, but once you figure out like it's just adjusting to the way you're driving, learn to keep an eye on it, no big deal. I made reference to this in my last video, but back before he was banned, Andrew Tate actually showed me the way to start this car and not have as many check engine lights come on, because that is something these are known for, right? Is electronic bugs, and a lot of them are reset by turning the car off, turning it back on. His solution to those problems were, before you crank the engine, you have to let all the electronics power up. So like you see, I turn everything on, let it power up, and then once everything's on, then you can start it. But you don't do it before that or you'll get lots of little things. It's a little slow some days. So like live in South Florida, that's sunny, it's hot, it's humid, you just want to kick the AC on, and you're like, hang on, let me power it up real quick. Okay, now start. Especially if it's been sitting. Like it hasn't been sitting, I've turned it on and off to show you a lot of stuff. It'll power up real quick. Now it's not a big deal, but like if you go into a store or something and then you come back out 30, 45 minutes later, everything's shut all the way down. So you then have to like let it repower back up, and it just takes longer. Ultimately, it's not a big deal. My number one biggest complaint on this is there's no Apple CarPlay. So it has Bluetooth, so the phone can connect to that no problem at all. But there's no Apple CarPlay, and there's absolutely no good spot. The way the air vents are, none of those clip on, so I actually ended up getting the clip here because it doesn't move, but it's so thick that it kept falling off, so it didn't work great. The last thing that seemed to be a problem for some people is they like to look at the engine, and like Lamborghinis and Ferraris, you can open up, take a look at it. Can't do that on this. It's actually screwed down, can't see it. But the benefit is all this space you can use when driving and needing to put bags and stuff.